Just because of the color of her skin, white police officers handcuffed a black woman in front of a federal courthouse, the very place where she had once claimed victory in some of the most important trials of her career. They had no idea the person they were humiliating was a federal prosecutor. From that moment on, Celeste went from being a victim to stepping into a dangerous fight that reached far beyond any courtroom. Was this simply the arrogance of a few individuals, or the result of a system hardwired with discrimination? Write comments where you're watching from, and stay until the end. The morning sky over Detroit was clear but not harsh. Sunlight slipping through gaps between the dark government buildings, casting thin golden stripes along the sidewalk. Celeste Morgan pulled into the parking lot in front of the Sixth Circuit, turned off the engine, and quietly unbuckled her seatbelt. She stayed seated for a moment longer, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, as if weighing something before stepping out. But she wasn't nervous. It was just a habit, double-checking everything once more. Today was the most important hearing of the month. Her team had spent nearly 20 days preparing. A complex federal case spanning 3 states, unpredictable witnesses, and a defense lawyer skilled in distraction and misdirection. Still, none of it made her hesitate. She knew every line of argument, every piece of evidence, every strategic turn the way she knew the face of her wristwatch. She opened the door and stepped out, heels touching the pavement in low cream pumps, a hard-shell briefcase tucked under her left arm. The tailored gray suit she wore was cleanly cut down to the seams, her collar pressed sharp, her white shirt buttoned up. Her black hair was pulled neatly back, revealing a narrow jawline, alert eyes, and a stride that never strayed from its path. The courthouse loomed ahead, tall, unfeeling, its stone exterior gleaming like a giant block of carved marble meant to announce authority. Celeste climbed the steps, each familiar underfoot, yet never taken for granted. She hadn't chosen to be a federal prosecutor for prestige or power. She did it out of a belief that justice is a responsibility for those who serve within it, that everyone deserves to be treated lawfully, regardless of skin color, title, or mistake. In her ideals, fairness made no exceptions, and the law left no room for prejudice. But Celeste was no longer young enough to believe that ideals stay untouched in a system shaped by compromise. She had seen how the system decided who was credible and who was a suspect. She knew the looks, those subtle triggers born of bias, and how easily they could turn an innocent person into someone who needed controlling, simply for not belonging to the trusted group. A car engine shut off behind her. She glanced, but didn't stop. A white and blue patrol car had pulled in slightly crooked, the driver's door swinging open just as an officer stepped out. A second man exited from the passenger side. Celeste didn't change direction, but she felt the shift in the air. It was a sense she had learned early on, the feel of eyes settling on your back for no reason other than your existence. A voice called out behind her, calm but stripped of any courtesy. "Ma'am, hold on a second." Celeste stopped and turned. The officer approaching her was tall and broad, right hand hovering casually near his belt. The badge on his chest read, "Officer Trent Harlan." The second one, shorter, graying at the temples, his eyes uneasy but silent, Mosley, followed behind more slowly. Something about him seemed familiar, but in this moment, familiarity felt out of place. Celeste stood tall, eyes steady with a measured politeness, waiting for an explanation. "That silver car is yours?" Harlan asked, nodding toward the BMW behind her. She nodded. "Yes." Harlan stepped half a pace closer. He scanned her from head to toe, blatantly, unnecessarily. She was in business attire, entering a federal courthouse at 8 in the morning. Nothing in that picture suggested a threat. Except for the color of her skin, we're looking for a suspect. Black female, 30s to 40s, business clothes, been seen around Midtown, tied to a string of equipment thefts. Celeste didn't respond right away. She simply held his gaze. After another beat, she said, "So, today, anyone in a dark suit with brown skin is automatically suspicious?" Harlan shrugged. "I'm just following the description." She nodded slightly, her lips pressing together, gaze sharpening like a blade sliding across glass. "So what now? Are you planning to search my bag outside a federal courthouse?" Mosley stepped in closer, his eyes flicking between her and his partner, but he said nothing. Celeste turned back to Harlan, no longer cautious in her tone. "I have nothing to declare except that I'm on my way to work." Harlan lowered his voice. "You should know it's better if you cooperate." Celeste kept her pulse steady, but what built inside her was a very particular kind of anger, the kind that seeps in, slow and acidic. She used to believe that working within the system would let people see her for who she truly was. But today, she wasn't a prosecutor in their eyes. She was just a figure, a skin tone, a body that fit some vague, suspicious profile. Celeste took a deep breath, kept her back straight, and slowly raised both hands, palms open. She had prosecuted cases where a single second's delay in a gesture could cost someone their life, and today, all of that knowledge was being turned on her. "I'm a federal prosecutor," she said, enunciating every word. Harlan kept walking toward her, pulling out the handcuffs as if he hadn't heard a thing. His eyes didn't even flinch at the title she'd just spoken. To him, it sounded like another excuse, a typical power move black people threw around when caught, a way to dodge responsibility. His gaze drifted over the gray suit, the neatly tied-back hair, and landed on Celeste's face with a look that was both dismissive and superior. In his mind, no prosecutor looked like her. To him, a black woman in a suit, carrying a briefcase, stepping out of a luxury car didn't make her powerful. It made her ridiculous, like putting on someone else's coat and pretending to be someone else. And he, shaped and sharpened by a culture wrapped in white and blue uniforms, had been taught to view such presence in such places as something out of place, something that needed correcting. Celeste saw all of that in his eyes. Harlan signaled for her to turn around, his voice curt and impatient. Every word he spoke came with the weight of someone who'd been itching to carry out this procedure for far too long. And Celeste, though she could have argued, could have presented proof, chose silence instead. As her wrists were pulled behind her, each finger tensed on instinct, and then came the cold sting of metal against skin, a long, clenched spasm running down her spine. The sound of the cuffs snapped shut twice, dry, hard, and final, locked, in front of the federal courthouse, the very place where she had stood time and again to speak of justice, of order, of trust. A group of tourists had just stepped off a bus nearby and turned their phones toward the scene. An employee inside the courthouse froze behind the glass wall, hands holding a stack of files but no longer turning the pages. Two women in janitorial uniforms passed by, glanced her way, then looked away, each maintaining a careful distance from the unfolding moment. Questions, if any, were swallowed down, replaced by an old instinct. Stay out of it. Stay safe. Celeste lifted her chin, eyes unfocused on anyone in particular. Her back remained straight, her head unbowed, but inside, she felt a searing hollow open up. She had once believed that if there were any place in America where truth could be weighed without bias, it had to be the steps of a federal courthouse. But it was right there that she watched the very ideals she had carried for nearly 2 decades begin to unravel. The grip of the cuffs was real. But the deeper violation wasn't in the bruising of her skin, it was in something buried further within. The belief that when she wore that suit, when she carried the law in her hands, she would be seen through the lens of justice, not just through the filter of her skin. But that belief had just been torn from her grasp. shattered into pieces beneath the cold stare of a man who wore the badge of the law, but never understood who the law was meant to protect. Inside the Sixth Circuit, the wall clock had just struck 8:14 a.m. Morning light filtered through the towering windows, casting long streaks across the polished stone floor. In courtroom 3, Judge Louise Chambers was flipping briskly through the case files for the upcoming hearing. The low hum of attorneys talking in the hallway blended with the familiar shuffle of footsteps, but she remained focused until, through the tall glass pane to her left, she caught a strange movement in the front plaza. At first, she didn't pay it much attention. A routine check, perhaps? But then her eyes landed on the silhouette of a woman being escorted toward a patrol car. A straight-backed posture, neatly tied hair, and a gray suit nearly identical to one she'd seen dozens of times on her courtroom floor. When the handcuffs glinted under the sunlight, her heart skipped a beat. She stood up abruptly, not needing a second look. It was Celeste Morgan, the woman who once silenced an entire jury with her closing arguments. The one who overturned 3 wrongful convictions in 2 years, forcing the city's prosecution office to rewrite its investigative training protocols. The one who had stood before her so many times with a calm voice and unwavering gaze. And now, that same woman was being treated like a street-level suspect. She rang the emergency bell by her desk and called for the chief clerk. Her voice rang clear through 2 corridors. Send security to the front lobby immediately. Suspend all scheduled hearings. I want to see the person being detained. Now. Less than 2 minutes later, Harlan and Mosley entered the intake hallway. Harlan still had a hand on Celeste's shoulder, his expression caught between familiarity and challenge, as if trying to assess the right posture now that he realized this wasn't a space he could command. Chambers was already waiting. Her eyes locked onto Harlan like steel against stone. Do you know who she is? Before he could answer, Celeste lifted her head and spoke, her voice low but distinct. Celeste Morgan, United States Attorney's Office. Mosley's eyes darted. Harlan's lip twitched, his mouth fumbling for a justification. But Chambers raised a hand, cutting him off. Remove the cuffs. Now. A long pause followed. Harlan didn't move. The air thickened, as if even the silence was watching to see whether he'd obey. That was an order, not a suggestion. Finally, Harlan reached down, inserted the key, and unlocked the cuffs. They clicked open with a dry metallic snap and dropped into Celeste's open palm. She rotated her wrists, a faint purple mark already forming against her brown skin. But she didn't speak. She simply gave Chambers a slight nod and walked inside, head high, as if she had never been stopped in the first place for looking like someone. Just 15 minutes later, an emergency hearing was convened in courtroom 7. Dozens of law enforcement officers, attorneys, and internal affairs representatives were already present because news, as always, spread faster than fire. Celeste stood at the witness stand, her hand resting on the wooden edge. Only the truth mattered now, and the feeling that today she wasn't speaking on behalf of others. She was speaking for herself. Her voice was steady, clear, never wavering. This morning, on my way into this courthouse where I serve, I was stopped outside the federal building. I identified myself. That changed nothing. I was handcuffed, escorted, and looked at by officers of the law as if I matched some cheap description. She paused, scanning the room, locking eyes with people she had once worked alongside through hundreds of cases. Some looked down, others held her gaze. If I didn't have my credentials in my wallet today, if I weren't Celeste Morgan with 18 years of service behind this bench, I might never have made it in here to say this. I would have become just another number in a report we all know by heart, but refuse to remember. The air in the courtroom pulled tight. No one spoke. But for many, it was the first time silence came with a sting in the chest. Judge Chambers sat upright, fingers interlocked before her, face more solemn than ever. When Celeste finished, the judge nodded with grave formality. "Your statement will be entered into the official record. We will pursue this matter to its full conclusion." At the back of the room, Harlan clenched his fists, jaw set, trying to maintain a stance of control, but his eyes had already begun to drift. The swagger he'd worn earlier had been pushed back by something he couldn't shake, the realization that the woman who looked like someone had just turned the system he thought he understood into a wall he couldn't climb. And for Celeste, this wasn't just about reclaiming dignity. It was a reckoning for everyone, a reminder that justice cannot stand if its guardians continue to act on instinct over principle, and that when her name was spoken, it wasn't just to remind anyone of who she was, but to make it undeniably clear she would not be silent, and she would not let them do this to anyone else again. When Celeste returned home in the late afternoon, the sunlight had turned a pale orange, casting a soft glow across the red brick walls of her porch. She stepped into the living room, removed her shoes, took off her coat, and eased herself down onto the familiar sofa, not because she was tired, but because her mind hadn't yet come down from the intensity of the morning's hearing. The words she'd spoken in court still echoed somewhere inside her chest, not out of doubt, but because she knew those words had just opened a door, and there was no way back through it. Her small home sat in a quiet neighborhood, where the lawns were neatly trimmed and mailboxes repainted each year. But even with everything appearing peaceful, Celeste could still feel the silent reverberations of the past pressing against the walls, slipping through the door frames, trailing each footstep on the wooden floor. She stood, poured herself a glass of water, and walked straight to her study at the end of the hallway. A metal filing cabinet with a coated lock sat tucked beneath a large desk. She keyed in the familiar sequence, heard the click, and pulled the drawer open. The old records were kept in a brown cardboard box, its lid frayed at the corners with age. She placed it on the desk, lifted the top, and began sifting through the files with care. There were the high school transcripts, letters of recommendation from teachers, a copy of her birth certificate, even scraps of notes her mother had saved, tiny, sticky notes with shaky handwriting. Celeste, always tell the truth. But she was looking for a different file, a document she had never told anyone she still kept. The incident happened when she was 17. It was a winter evening in Grand Rapids. She was leaving the library late, arms full of books for her final paper. On her walk home, she noticed a car left running with no one inside. Just as she passed by, a patrol car sped in. 3 officers jumped out, shouting sharply, guns drawn in under 3 seconds. She hadn't even spoken before one of them slammed her to the pavement, his knee on her back, her wrist twisted behind her, and the last thing she remembered was the crack of bone when her left arm snapped mid-forearm. The next day at the hospital, she learned they had suspected her of trying to steal the car, even though there was no evidence, even though camera footage showed she never touched the vehicle. They cited suspicious behavior. No one was charged. No apology was ever issued. And somehow, the incident never appeared in any of the official records she later requested. She had once believed that things like this would be the fire driving her to change the system from within. That if she climbed high enough, worked hard enough, wore the right suit and spoke the language of the law perfectly, things would be different. She believed it so deeply, she had made herself a living testament to that belief. But today, after being handcuffed outside the courthouse for looking like someone, she knew that belief needed rewriting. Not to give up on it, but to stop confusing it with illusion. She looked at her left hand, at the faint scar along her wrist, the only evidence that remained. The injury had healed long ago, but every time the weather changed, the bone underneath still ached. And now, in this room full of paperwork and the sterile white light of the ceiling lamp, that pain returned in a different form, a memory that needed no witness, that couldn't be erased by any missing file. Celeste pulled out her chair and sat at the desk. She opened her laptop, logged into the prosecutor's office database, and searched for the old case number. But, to her surprise, no results came up. There was no record of the beating she'd endured. It was as if it had never happened. But she still held something the system couldn't delete: memory. And now, she knew she would no longer keep it to herself. She opened a new document and titled it 1997, Statement of Memory. The words appeared stark and white against the gray background. Her fingers began to type. Each word, each sentence, not to recount the past, but to demand its recognition. She knew that if she didn't tell, no one else would. And if this truth stayed buried, it would resurface again in other forms, with others less fortunate, who would never hear an apology. She stopped typing after the first paragraph and sat still for a few moments. In the thick quiet of the room, a thought flashed through her mind. Maybe this scar was the beginning of something bigger. Not revenge, but a reckoning. Not to punish, but to force remembrance. And this time she wasn't writing out of idealism. She was writing because the truth needed repeating, until no one could ignore it. Her mind drifted from the room down a deeper hallway where scattered fragments began to fit together. Her arrest at 17 wasn't the only thing that had ever been handled internally. Throughout her career, she'd heard colleagues of color talk about missing files, ignored complaints, and officers with histories of misconduct who still rose through the ranks. At first, she thought it was just the usual boys' club protecting its own. But, gradually, the patterns grew too sharp, too systemic to dismiss. And now, with what had happened in front of the courthouse, and with that missing file, a file lost from the hands of a federal prosecutor, this could no longer be explained as a clerical error. There was something beneath the surface, an invisible structure shaping outcomes, leaving no trail but deciding who got protected and who got erased. And if that was true, then men like Harlan, arrogant and sheltered, were merely the visible tip of something much deeper. The next morning, a thin layer of rain settled over the tin rooftops and roads of Detroit, leaving droplets clinging to car windows like quiet scratches. Celeste sat in her car for a moment before walking into the office. She had written until past 3 in the morning, then stared at the ceiling without closing her eyes, not out of exhaustion, but because one face kept looping through her mind. The face of Rick Mosley, the man standing behind Harlan when she was handcuffed. The man who said nothing, didn't step forward, just kept his gaze somewhere between the void and denial. She hadn't recognized him at the time. Years had passed, bodies had changed, and in that moment, her mind wasn't searching for anyone familiar. But when she opened the old case box again to dig for pieces of what happened when she was 17, a photo slipped out from under a legal aid approval form, a case file from years ago, one she had volunteered to defend during her time as a law clinic intern. The defendant had been a 15-year-old boy accused of stealing a watch from a store near his school. There was no physical evidence, no security footage, and even the complainant eventually recanted. Celeste had pursued that case all the way through, and in the end, the record was cleared. Rick went back to school, and shortly after, faded from her radar. Now he wore a badge, a uniform, and had stood still in the face of injustice. Not as a powerless kid, but as a grown man who knew exactly what he was turning away from. At noon, as Celeste exited the West Wing hallway of the courthouse, she saw him standing beside the coffee machine, holding a paper cup, his shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to disappear inside his jacket. He didn't need to turn around to know she was approaching. No words were spoken as the distance between them closed to a few steps. The space tightened into a still, tense silence. Celeste stood upright, her eyes fixed on his shoulder. He didn't look back, only nodded slowly, like a delayed acknowledgement. "Now I remember you," she said, her voice low but weighted. Rick tightened his grip on the cup, then turned to face her. His expression was a mix of guilt and discomfort. "I knew you recognized me," he said. "Not in that moment," Celeste replied. "At that moment, you were just another stranger standing still while I was treated like a criminal, right in front of my colleagues, right outside the courthouse I serve." Rick bit his lower lip. I recognized you as soon as Harlan stepped in, but I couldn't do anything," she interrupted. "I understand. Rank matters. Subordinates follow orders. Cops stick to the line. I get it. It wasn't just about rank," he said, eyes lowering to the tile floor. "It was fear. Harlan isn't the kind of guy you cross easily. He's got backing. I've seen people who spoke up get pushed out, blamed for things they didn't do. I have a wife, a young kid. I couldn't risk everything for one moment of defiance." Celeste fell quiet. The rain outside had stopped, and only a few slow drops slid down the window. The air in the lobby thickened with layers of raw honesty. "Your silence didn't destroy me," she said, her gaze steady on his face, "but it gave them permission to believe they could do it again, to someone else, and next time, that person might not get the chance to speak up. It could be a teenager with no lawyer, a father carrying his child home. It could be your kid." Rick said nothing. Her words had cut through the fog of moral hesitation he'd been hiding in, the belief that staying still was somehow harmless. But now he understood. Doing nothing was still a choice, and that choice allowed darkness to spread without making a sound. "When I was a kid," he said softly, "I used to think that if someone like you stood up for me, everything would be different." He paused, swallowed hard. "Yesterday, I don't even know whose side I was on. I couldn't say it out loud." "You still have time," Celeste said, turning to walk away. "The question is, will you use it to stay quiet, or finally do what's right?" She didn't look back, but behind her, Rick remained frozen in place, unmoving. The paper cup in his hand had gone cold long ago, but in his mind, something else had just begun to warm. The thing he should have felt a long time ago: responsibility. And maybe today was the day he'd start to repay it. Celeste returned to the office on an afternoon with no wind in the air, but inside her, a storm was quietly building. The encounter with Rick Mosley left a longer echo than she had expected, not just because the truth had been hidden for too long, but because his fear reflected something she understood deeply. Truth is never strong enough if those who see it choose to look away. But she was not one of them. She had never waited to be rescued, and she certainly wasn't going to wait for someone else to expose the lies. If anyone was going to pull the curtain back, it would be her. On the third floor of the district attorney's office building, there was an internal archive, a secure storage unit where unlisted files, removed directories, and reports accessible only to senior personnel were kept. Celeste had been in there before, but never like this, never in secrecy. Today, she wore an old access badge, a temporary technician ID she had held on to from a time she assisted the internal investigations team last year. No one would expect a prosecutor like her to still have it, and no one imagined that after everything that had happened, she would use it to search for the truth about the very office she worked in. The door opened after 2 scans. Inside, the air was colder than in the hallway. Concrete walls were coated with moisture-proof paint. Overhead lights glowed a pale yellow, and metal filing units stretched from floor to ceiling, marked with internal codes. But she didn't follow the familiar indexing system. She remembered something Rick once said: some files had no numbers, only retrievable if you knew the precise path. She accessed the data terminal at the records clerk's desk and entered a character string previously used in cases involving dismissed complaints. Nothing showed but a blank screen. She changed the parameters, this time logging in through her old administrative account, which still had clearance for federal-level review cases. A folder appeared. No name, just a gray icon wedged among dozens of other files. She opened it. The interface loaded more slowly than usual, as if filtering through layers of encryption. Then dozens of files surfaced. Inside were documents with ominous titles: high-risk evaluation, uncooperative patterning, cross-agency flagging. She clicked the first one. A spreadsheet opened, nearly 200 rows long. Each row was a name, ID number, and a threat classification. She scrolled down. The vast majority were African American, a few Asian American, several Latinx, and almost no white names. The listed reasons for monitoring froze her in place: participation in 2020 protests, history of filing complaints against public agencies, use of anti-police language on social media, and mentions in community meetings opposing urban redevelopment plans. She opened a subfolder labeled Internal Com, Do Not Archive. Dozens of emails appeared from an internal address. The sender was Gerald Faulkner, the district's chief prosecutor, Celeste's direct superior. The email subjects outlined a deliberate strategy developed over at least 3 years. Expand Tier 12 list to support community protection agencies. Prioritize behavioral data extraction from medical and credit records. Do not forward complaints involving Tier 12 individuals to the DOJ. One attachment was an internal memo emphasizing the need to maintain informal consensus with the city police department to avoid media conflict, and instructed staff to report unusual activity of flagged individuals without waiting for a formal subpoena. Celeste leaned back in the chair, her hand still on the mouse, eyes locked on the screen. Her name wasn't on the list, but that didn't bring relief. On the contrary, it only reinforced what she had just uncovered. This was a system designed to conceal, to control, and to silence. It wasn't aimed at individuals. It targeted those with the power to rewrite the narrative. And Gerald Faulkner wasn't acting alone. The email replies came from unfamiliar domains, some with no signatures, others written in an eerily clinical tone, encrypted in the sterile language of bureaucracy. She looked at the folder title again, Tier 12. A neutral, meaningless label, easily dismissed as some operational code. But to her, it was no longer a designation. It was an accusation. Celeste stood up, closed the terminal, and slipped a copy of the files onto a secure drive she had brought with her. As she turned to leave, she looked once more around the archive room, a place once meant to preserve the memory of the justice system, now transformed into a graveyard of truth. This time, she wouldn't stay silent. No more files would be buried under coded names. And Gerald Faulkner would no longer be just the head of the system. He would be the center of something she intended to bring into the light, with everything she had. The name Asha Wilkins appeared on line 117 of the Tier 12 spreadsheet. Celeste almost passed it over, until her eyes paused at the note beside it. Flagged for suspected possession of a dangerous item. Age, 15. No record of prosecution. Status, unknown. She typed the name into the internal incident report system. No open file. Checked the federal case database. No investigation ID. A teenage girl, flagged as a risk, who had once gone missing for 3 weeks, and the legal system hadn't left so much as a footprint. That wasn't unsettling because it was rare. It was chilling because it felt too familiar. Names that quietly disappeared into invisibility, while no one stopped to ask why. She traced the listed address from the summary note. It was located in East Detroit, a cluster of low-rise homes crowded between old corner stores and aging gas stations. That afternoon, the sky was coated in a dull gray layer of clouds, making everything look washed in faded tones. Celeste parked a block away and walked up a crooked set of steps to ring the bell at House 14C. An elderly woman, thin and slightly hunched, opened the door. Her hair was stark white, her face lined with the marks of both time and worry. She was Asha's mother. "Sorry to drop by unannounced. I'm Celeste Morgan," she said, extending her hand though hesitating slightly. "I'm investigating a covert surveillance system used by the county. I believe your daughter's name was added to it." The woman didn't take her hand, but only stood there. A beat passed before she gave a faint nod and opened the door wider. "Come in. I don't have tea, but there's water." Her voice was hoarse from too much coughing, and Celeste could hear the weariness in every step she took back toward the living room. The home was modest. The wooden floor was warped, the sofa patched with brown duct tape, and the only photograph on the table was a portrait of Asha at 10 years old, smiling brightly. Celeste sat at the edge of the seat, waiting as the woman returned with a glass of water. But she didn't sit right away. She stood behind the chair, her hands resting on its back like she needed something to lean on. "Asha was stopped while walking to school," the woman began, not waiting for Celeste to ask. "They said she looked like the description of a teen carrying a prohibited item, but she only had a backpack and a lunchbox. I don't know what happened after that. People said she was detained, but I never got any notice. No paperwork, no phone call." Celeste tightened her grip on the cushion beside her. "Did you report it to the police?" I called. "They said no such incident was on record. I went to the station, and they sent me away. I went to the public defender's office. No one would take the case. They told me I didn't have a file, so I didn't have grounds to sue. I had no money, and at the time I was also in the hospital with a diabetic complication. 3 weeks. For 3 weeks, I had no idea where my baby was." "And your daughter came home?" Celeste asked, her voice dropping. The woman nodded. "Exactly on the 21st day. The door opened at 3 in the morning. She walked in silently, hair a mess, shirt covered in mud, and her eyes, they weren't the same. She didn't say anything, no explanation. Ever since then, she's stayed in her room. Keeps the door locked all day. I knock, leave her meals outside. She doesn't go to school, hasn't stepped past the porch." Celeste looked around the room, then back at the woman. "Do you think you're ready to talk about this publicly? If needed, I can protect Asha. I have the authority to reopen an investigation, but I need your permission. I need you to step forward with me." The woman offered a tired smile, a breath more than an expression. "I don't know if I have the strength to stand before anyone anymore, but if you can do something, I won't stand in your way." Celeste rose from her seat. "I'm not just doing this for your daughter. I'm doing it for people like you, people forced into silence not because they have nothing to say, but because no one would listen." On the way back, the rain began again. Light, but persistent, gathering into long droplets on the windshield. Celeste sat in her car, watching the water streak down the glass like time draining from a story never told. Asha Wilkins was a name no one remembered, from an incident no one recorded. But that silence wasn't a disappearance, it was a waiting for someone willing to look back. And Celeste was that person, because she understood better than anyone. Some people lose their names in the records, but they still have a voice in justice. And those voices, when called at the right moment, can shake the foundation of systems that once believed they were above question. The district attorney's headquarters rose like a white stone fortress in the heart of Detroit, its facade lined with towering columns that evoke the image of an ancient Greek temple, stoic, imposing, and self-important. To most, this place stood as a symbol of order and the rule of law. But, to Celeste, it had become little more than the polished shell of a system built to shine outward while hiding the rot no one dared name. Today, she wasn't here to file a case or attend a meeting. She was here to confront the man behind the shadow she had just pulled into the light. Gerald Faulkner, the district attorney. The air in the lobby carried the scent of cold stone and disinfectant, pumped in steady rhythm from ceiling vents. Celeste walked straight to the front desk without shifting her gaze, though she knew everyone here had already been notified. The receptionist in a pale gray suit looked up from her screen but asked no questions, just motioned toward the private elevator, where 2 security officers were already waiting. Before entering, she was instructed to leave behind her phone, smartwatch, and even her courthouse ID. Every personal item was placed into a stainless steel tray and passed through a scanner. A female officer directed her into a side room for a secondary screening. No cameras, only a bare metal table and a ceiling light focused directly on her shoulders. "Please, open your wallet, including the inner lining," the officer said, her voice flat and cold. Celeste handed it over without hesitation, calmly unhooked the strap, opened each compartment, and let them scan every inch. She had anticipated all of it. They weren't going to let her through with any electronic device still on her, and that only confirmed what she already knew. Faulkner feared the truth being heard, recorded, and brought into the open. After a full body scan, the officer gave a small nod, though her eyes still scanned Celeste with quiet suspicion. "Nothing unusual," she said, almost with regret. One of the men from the lobby extended a hand toward the elevator. As the doors closed, the air thickened. Celeste didn't look at anyone, didn't say a word, but each step she took landed with certainty, as if she were walking into the heart of a power that had been embedded so deep in the system, it had forgotten what it felt like to be questioned by someone it once thought it could control. Faulkner's office sat at the very top, where sunlight streamed in through high windows and fell across his oak desk, casting him in an aura of untouchable authority. He didn't stand when she entered. He simply set down his pen, gave a shallow nod, and gestured for her to sit. "Miss Morgan," he said in a tone that bordered on cheerful, as if greeting an old acquaintance. "I hear you've had quite a busy few days." Celeste took her seat, her gaze unwavering. "I've found something you didn't want anyone to find." Faulkner smiled, pouring a glass of water from a crystal carafe and sliding it toward her. "Ah, Tier 12? Let me guess. You stumbled onto some old emails, a couple of dusty spreadsheets, and now you think you've uncovered some grand, wicked conspiracy." He folded his hands, tilted his head slightly, still wearing the pleasant veneer of someone who believed he was untouchable. "You'd be smart to leave that alone. You are smart, Celeste, smart enough to know there are things better left untouched." "It's not because I'm smart that I came here," she replied. "It's because I know better than anyone the cost of silence. I was a teenager once, slammed to the ground, arm broken in the street because I matched a description. I've prosecuted cases where evidence conveniently disappeared, where witnesses became unavailable or slipped through the cracks. I thought those were coincidences, until I saw the name Tier 12. He set the file down, leaning forward across the desk with the calm of a man who had been challenged before and had never found a reason to flinch. "You're a decorated prosecutor, respected, articulate, always on time in court, but you've made one critical mistake." Faulkner leaned back in his chair, voice laced with condescension. "You believe the law is something sacred, independent, that the justice you think you serve exists in the form you imagine." Celeste said nothing. Her eyes never blinked. "That thing you call racism?" He raised an eyebrow. "It's not a system. It's a habit, something woven into the bloodstream of this culture from its earliest days. From how we teach our children about safe neighborhoods to how police are trained to react to skin tone. It's not a conspiracy, it's a way of life. And what I do, what you found, is just about making sure things don't stray too far from that order." He stepped away from the desk, walking slowly toward the window with his back to her. His voice dropped lower, taking on the tone of a lecture. "You see oppression. I see stability. You see surveillance. I see disorder prevention. You see suppression. I see risk management. This system doesn't exist because it's fair. It exists because it works. And efficiency, not fairness, is what keeps those buildings standing, keeps people going to work, and gives someone like you, regardless of your color, a seat at the table to argue. Celeste didn't respond right away. She let the silence hang for a few seconds, just long enough to highlight a gap, not only in power, but in perception. "And when did you find it?" Faulkner turned back around, that cold smile back on his lips. "You thought you had the blade? You think a few spreadsheets and old emails can tear down a mechanism built on decades of compromise, fear, and unofficial rules? You won't win, Celeste. You can't win against a city that thinks everything is fine as long as no one screams. And you certainly can't win against a system where every silent person is another brick holding it up." He stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. His expression was almost sympathetic. "My advice? Let it go. Your position still has value, if you know how to keep it." Celeste leaned slightly forward. "I'm not here to change the whole system in one day. I'm here to shine light on the parts you've kept buried in the dark for years. And I didn't come to ask permission." The meeting ended with a handshake, ceremonial, but both of them knew no real contact had passed between them in that moment. As Celeste stepped out of the room, the afternoon light in the hallway had softened, leaving the corridor awash in a dull gray haze. She didn't look back, didn't say a word. Each footstep echoed steadily against the stone floor like the ticking of a countdown. Outside, the world remained still, but inside her, the most important thing had already happened. Not because the conversation had reached agreement, but because for the first time, Faulkner had exposed his true nature, unmasked, unapologetic, and unguarded. What he didn't know was this: the conversation didn't vanish when the office door closed. Beneath the gray fabric of Celeste's suit, the third button on her left lapel blinked with a faint red light, invisible to any eye not sharp enough to catch it. A miniature, concealed camera, linked directly to an encrypted transmitter hidden inside her wallet, had recorded the entire exchange, from the warnings to the cold rationale behind control over justice. And when she placed her hand over her chest to adjust the front of her blazer before leaving the building, her fingertip gently tapped that button, like someone triggering justice with the only thing they trust, the truth. This time there would be no denial. Not by internal files, not by administrative power, and certainly not by silence. Celeste returned to her apartment just as dusk settled in. Detroit was bathed in that deep amber light of a city pretending everything was still under control. But she knew better. When structures of power begin to shake from the inside, calm surfaces are the first sign of an approaching storm. She opened her laptop and plugged in the encrypted drive hidden inside her wallet. The entire conversation between her and Gerald Faulkner lit up on screen. Every word clear, every image sharp, down to the flicker in his expression as he shifted from composed to condescending. She replayed one line over and over, the moment Faulkner stood at the window and said, "You'll never beat a city that thinks everything's fine as long as no one is screaming." That line hit harder than any threat, not because of the arrogance, but because within that arrogance lay a kind of indifference fed and fattened by systemic silence. Celeste took a deep breath. She knew it was time to break that silence, not with slogans, not with speeches, but with truth that could not be denied. She gathered all the materials into one encrypted folder. Faulkner's emails, the Tier 12 data spreadsheet, Asha Wilkins' case report, and the video of her being handcuffed in front of the courthouse. In that moment, Celeste was no longer just a prosecutor. She was someone preparing to dismantle the system using the very tools it had once wielded against people like her: evidence, truth, and exposure. The handcuff video was trimmed down, showing only what mattered: her in a gray suit, offering no resistance, restrained in the street, in front of the public and the federal courthouse. No narration, no subtitles, just one pinned caption at the top. If this is how they treat a federal prosecutor, what do you think happens to those without a voice? The video was posted at 3 a.m. on an anonymous account, but was linked to a network of lawyers, journalists, and social justice organizations she had worked with for over a decade. She didn't attach her name to the post, but within 3 hours, the community already knew who was in the footage. Over 20,000 shares by morning, 300,000 views before noon, and over 1 million by the end of the day. Detroit ignited in silence. Messages of support flooded her personal phone, from old friends, colleagues, and strangers she had never met. You made me believe my daughter matters. Don't stop. We stand with you. But with that came something else, too. Threats, smear attempts, vicious comments. Some called her a race-baiting agitator. Others accused her of undermining trust in law enforcement, or labeled her a traitor to the flag. Faulkner responded not long after. Headlines appeared across major outlets claiming the video was manipulated and that a full internal investigation had been launched to review the matter. A few influential voices in local politics defended the system, suggesting Celeste may have acted in a way that confused or misled law enforcement. The division became stark. One side elevated Celeste as a symbol of courage, a voice for marginalized communities long silenced. The other painted her as a destabilizer, someone willing to burn it all down for the sake of moral pride. But Celeste said nothing, not out of fear, but because she knew silence, when used precisely, could be a weapon. She wanted the system to speak first, to reveal its reflexes, its instincts, to show the public what it truly believed without the polish of a press release. And then, just 3 days after the video went live, an email arrived from the U.S. Department of Justice. The subject line was short, but carried the weight of steel. Urgent hearing request, Senate Judiciary Committee. They didn't call her an agitator, didn't call her a victim. In the letter, they addressed her by full title. Assistant United States Attorney Celeste Morgan, requesting her presence at a special hearing on abuse of power, racially motivated surveillance systems, and potential constitutional violations within local prosecutorial offices. Celeste sat alone in the dim apartment, the email still glowing on her screen, though her eyes were fixed elsewhere, on the skyline, where downtown towers faded into darkness. She knew Faulkner would strike back, knew she had just pulled back the curtain on a stage far too large to retreat from. But that no longer mattered, because this time, she didn't just have evidence. She had the public, she had light, and she had the truth, something Faulkner had underestimated, and something that could no longer be buried. Hearing Room 4 inside the Capitol was packed to capacity. Every seat in the audience was filled by journalists, congressional staffers, civil rights advocates, and everyday citizens lucky enough to get a pass. On the polished wooden tables sat nameplates of senators, each one representing a different state, a different ideology, and a different facet of America now being forced into the light by this very hearing. At the center of the room, seated at the witness table, Celeste sat upright, both hands resting neatly on the dark wood. The lights above cast a clear glow over her face, highlighting the same gray suit she had worn many times before. This time, not hiding a secret camera, but worn openly as armor for a confrontation with a system that had reached the outer limits of denial. Presiding over the hearing was Senator Maya Hill, the first black woman to chair the Senate Judiciary Committee in U.S. history. She sat at the center dais, her gaze sharp but steady. As the session began, she spoke only one line: "Justice cannot wait for the system to feel ready. Today, we will hear the truth from someone who has lived inside it." Celeste was sworn in and asked to begin her testimony. Every camera was already rolling. She didn't look at any particular senator. She didn't glance at the cameras. She looked straight ahead, as if speaking to the entire country. "My name is Celeste Morgan. I'm a federal prosecutor serving the Eastern District of Detroit. 2 weeks ago, I was handcuffed in front of the courthouse I serve every day, without cause, other than that I resembled someone. That was not a mistake. It was a living demonstration of a system capable of stripping dignity in seconds, if you happen to wear a color that falls outside the unconscious default." She paused for a few seconds. The room was silent. "But I am not here today to speak only about my own incident. I'm here because I discovered something more dangerous than any weapon, something no one sees. Data. Data can be a tool of liberation, or an invisible chain, if it's programmed with bias." A few senators exchanged glances. Celeste continued. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried unmistakable weight. "During my investigation, I uncovered a system called Predictive Suspect Monitoring. It's a program rolled out by a 7-state consortium, funded under the guise of crime prevention. But what is its real nature? It's a system built on arrest data, most of which originates from a time when communities of color were policed far more aggressively than others." One senator interjected, "You're saying the system is flawed from the beginning?" Celeste nodded. "Not flawed technically. It runs exactly as it was programmed. And that's the terrifying part. It's not a glitch. It's prejudice, encoded." She displayed a chart on the large screen behind her, showing that in predominantly black neighborhoods, the number of individuals labeled as potential suspects was 3 to 5 times higher than in predominantly white areas, even though the actual crime rates were not significantly different. This tool pulls from outdated arrest records, unresolved civil complaints, and even unverified patrol reports. All of it is fed into the system and turned into risk indicators. And then the system uses those indicators to predict who should be more closely monitored. It doesn't require evidence, just the wrong address, the wrong last name, or skin that doesn't match the bias embedded in the data set. Another senator asked, "Do you have a specific case?" Celeste nodded again. A 15-year-old girl named Asha Wilkins stopped while walking to school. No crime, no evidence, but she was flagged because she lived in a so-called high-risk zone. What happened next? 3 weeks missing, and no one asked. No reports, no investigation, no media coverage, and the system labeled it as optimized risk prevention. I call it the destruction of a life. There were soft coughs in the room, a few heads shaken. Celeste kept her eyes forward. She didn't flinch, didn't lower her voice. "Here's what I need to make clear. We've become comfortable using the language of technology to cover up old biases. We call it risk management, algorithms, and machine learning models. But machines don't create prejudice, people do. And people have built an entire system to reproduce that prejudice under the guise of neutrality. We didn't fix the problem. We taught the machine to replicate it faster and without accountability." A heavy silence settled over the room. No one spoke, no gavel struck, no rebuttal followed. Only the sense that something deep in the foundation had started to shift. Celeste closed with a sentence that was not a plea, but a declaration. "Data has no soul, but we do. If we refuse to look at how we've used data to preserve discrimination, then our failure won't be due to a lack of technology. It will be due to a lack of conscience." She stepped down from the witness stand in silence without looking back. But in that moment, the entire country began to talk, not just about an arrest, but about a system that had quietly operated within their midst, line by line, update by update, under the harmless label of risk analysis. And this time, no one could say, "We didn't know." 4 days after the Senate hearing, America sat before a shattered mirror, trying to piece together its broken reflection to see the face of a system it had once trusted. Excerpts from Celeste's testimony filled the front pages of major newspapers. TV anchors repeated the phrase, "encoded bias like a thunderclap shaken the foundation of modern justice." Information spread at dizzying speed across academic panels, viral tweets, and protest placards carried through city streets. Celeste watched the movement unfold from just the right distance, not lost in the crowd, but not withdrawing from its momentum. She knew this moment was a double-edged sword. When the truth rises, there are always those waiting to see it collapse under the weight of its fragility. But she was not one of them. She hadn't come to light a fire and walk away. She had come to carry that flame to where it was meant to burn, and she knew exactly where it was going next. Faulkner. On Friday afternoon, Celeste stepped up to the press podium inside a packed auditorium at the headquarters of the National Civil Rights Bar Association. Behind her, 3 massive screens. On the table before her, a thick file. Every page marked, every quote time-stamped, every conversation documented. The press filled the room wall to wall. Microphones pointed at her like silent barrels, waiting for the first shot. She didn't open with a speech. She opened with sound. The screens lit up with the first audio clip, Gerald Faulkner's voice, deep and dismissive. "If the media asks, label it an internal matter. We're under no obligation to explain. Just keep the narrative inside the courthouse." Then another voice, a man later confirmed to be Detroit's deputy chief of police. "She's not going to escalate it. People like Morgan, they need the system to survive. They won't dare turn against it." The room froze. Celeste let the clip run a few more seconds before cutting the feed. She looked directly at the crowd, not with the eyes of a victim, but with the resolve of someone wielding truth as a weapon. What you just heard is not the voice of 2 public servants concerned about community stability. It's proof of a deeper disease in the system, the distortion of language to distort accountability. When someone is illegally handcuffed, they call it professional discretion. When an algorithm targets people of color, they call it data optimization. And when we present evidence, they call it an internal issue. She raised the file in front of her and tapped it 3 times. Contained here are over 70 pages of recordings, emails, and internal communications between officials in the Detroit Prosecutor's office and the police department, all coordinated to steer public opinion, dodge legal liability, and conceal racially motivated surveillance policy. I will release all of it. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions from every corner. Are you confident in the authenticity of the recordings? Could these officials sue you for invasion of privacy? Aren't you afraid of political retaliation? Celeste kept her hands firmly on the table and answered with one line. Privacy cannot be used as a cloak for abuses of power, and fear has never stopped me from doing what's right. That evening, the story broke nationwide. CNN, MSNBC, and NPR. Every major outlet aired special reports. Legal panels, live town halls, and university classrooms all revolved around one question. If those entrusted with the law abuse the system to protect themselves, who protects justice? Faulkner, for the first time in years, did not appear before the media. His office issued a vague statement denying involvement, but avoiding direct rebuttal of the recordings. And that, Celeste knew, was the most dangerous space, the gap between denial and silence, where the public begins to realize the wall in front of them might not be stone. It might just be velvet. What began as a ripple became a wave. It spread beyond Detroit, beyond Michigan, into Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, where communities of color publicly demanded full disclosure of every person flagged and profiled by algorithmic risk assessments. Independent investigations were launched. Mayors began asking questions. And for the first time, Americans, from war veterans to bus drivers, from lawyers to single mothers, spoke the same sentence. If they did that to a federal prosecutor, what would they do to us? Celeste, despite receiving interview requests from every major outlet, held to one principle. She would not go on television. She refused to become a symbol. She didn't want to be the banner. She wanted to be the hand that planted it, right where it needed to stand. Because she knew, in a system that has learned to invoke internal matters like a magic spell to deflect the truth, the only way to break it is to drag it into the town square, where nothing can hide. And this time, the light wasn't just fueled by outrage, it was carried by people who knew the law and knew how to use it as a blade sharp enough to cut through the cords strangling their freedom. On the day of the community forum, the auditorium inside the Detroit Cultural Center was packed. The front rows were filled with activists, teachers, parents, lawyers, and students, but not politicians. This wasn't an event for political sound bites. It was a space for voices that had long been overlooked to finally be heard. Celeste stood backstage, her eyes tracking every minute, every movement of the students walking up to the stage to share their stories. Stories of being stopped without reason, watched without cause, denied opportunity for being labeled a potential risk. She knew the next part was the most important, not just for her, but for the person she had spent a week gently convincing. Asha Wilkins, the 15-year-old girl who had disappeared for 3 weeks without explanation, who had locked herself in her room for nearly a year after losing faith in the world outside, was now seated in a folding chair near the side of the stage. Asha wasn't wearing a crisp button-down shirt like the others. She had on an old hoodie, her hands tightly gripping a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded many times. She still refused to go on stage. She said she wasn't brave enough, but Celeste didn't push. She simply asked, "If you can't speak, maybe you can write, and if you want, I'll read it for you." Asha hadn't answered right away, but the day before the event, the paper was quietly placed in Celeste's hand. When it was her turn to speak, Celeste didn't step up to the main podium. She walked out to the front of the stage, at eye level with the audience, holding the letter in both hands, not like a speech, but like evidence. "The next story isn't mine," she began slowly. "It belongs to a young girl who once believed there was no place in this world for people who looked like her. She didn't want to stand on stage, but she permitted me to speak for her. And so I ask you all to listen as if she were standing here herself." She paused. The room was so quiet, you could hear the soft rustle of clothing against chairs. Then Celeste began to read. "My name is Asha Wilkins. I'm 15 years old. I used to be a top student, and I was working toward a full college scholarship. I studied day and night to prepare for the SAT, because that was my only way out of a place where everyone expects people like me to go nowhere. But that day, the day of the test, I got stopped on the way there. They said I looked like someone they were watching. They didn't show proof, didn't call my mom, didn't let me go. I was late. They wouldn't let me take the test. I lost the scholarship. 4 years of effort, gone because of one look." Celeste kept reading, her eyes steady on the paper. Her voice didn't shake, but the room held a weight that thickened with every word. "I wandered for 3 weeks after that. I didn't want to go home. I thought I had failed, but then I met others, black people living through even harder things than I did. Some were kicked out of their homes for unpaid traffic tickets. Some had never once heard their name pronounced right in a job interview. I realized I wasn't alone, but I also realized this world was never built for us to succeed. I used to think, if I'm not allowed to rise, why bother trying? But then Ms. Celeste came. She didn't ask me what I wanted to say. She asked if I needed to be heard, and for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. Today I can't stand here. I'm still scared. But if there's someone out there like me, sitting in the dark, thinking none of their efforts matter, I want them to know, one prejudiced decision destroyed 4 years of my work. I can't get it back, but I can write this so that someone after me doesn't have to live through the same." Celeste folded the paper slowly, holding it firmly in her hands. She didn't say anything more. The room remained frozen. Then, from the back, a middle-aged woman stood up and began to clap. Someone else followed. And then the whole auditorium erupted, not in applause for a speech, but like they were clapping against a wall that had surrounded children like Asha for years. And now, finally, a crack had opened. Asha remained in her seat near the stage, arms wrapped around her knees, her face tucked into her sleeve. But in that moment, as the room gave her a standing ovation, she wasn't ready to accept. She lifted her head just slightly, eyes glistening, lips pressed tight. Celeste caught her gaze, and nothing needed to be said between them. Because of Celeste, Asha didn't need to stand on a stage to have a voice. She only needed to be heard, to be understood, and to be called by her name. And that alone was enough to shift a part of the world that had once made her believe it didn't belong to her. And for Celeste, that was the reason she kept standing. Not for herself, but for those who hadn't yet stood, but were already listening. That afternoon, a soft fog blanketed Detroit, resting like a silver veil over rooftops, as if the city itself was trying to soothe its pulse after days of marches, interviews, and public unrest. Celeste had just returned from a community gathering at the high school Asha once attended when a message popped up on her phone. "Someone's waiting for you in the parking garage." There was no name, just a still image from a security camera. A man standing next to an old Civic, charcoal jacket, hood pulled low. But Celeste knew the posture. It was Rick Mosley. She didn't call back, didn't ask why. She simply grabbed her keys, slipped on a light coat, and made her way downstairs. Rick stood still. He didn't step forward, didn't wave. He just watched as she approached, holding a small plastic container with no markings. Celeste stopped 2 paces away. The amber light above them cast long shadows, revealing deep lines near his eyes, not from age, but from the slow erosion of guilt. "It's a hard drive," Rick said first, his voice low but steady. "A backup from the precinct's old server. I copied it before they wiped the system." Celeste didn't hide her surprise, but she didn't interrupt. Rick opened the box and pulled out the drive, wrapped tightly in shock-resistant tape, and handed it to her. "Everything's on there. Every exchange related to Tier 12. Emails, surveillance maps, mostly black neighborhoods, some Asian, and especially locations tied to past complaints against the police. They called it risk assessment, but it was just a list of people to watch more closely." Celeste tightened her grip on the drive as if the weight of it came not from the hardware, but from the truths compressed inside. A surveillance system wrapped in administrative language, yet executed by eyes trained to view skin color and zip codes as threats. Rick exhaled softly. "I knew they were watching you," he said, still not meeting her gaze. "Even before the courthouse arrest, you were listed as a Level 3 alert for frequent visits to flagged neighborhoods. I stayed quiet, told myself I wasn't the one hurting you. But when I saw Harlan cuff you, I saw the same look I had when I was 17, forced to plead guilty because no one believed me. You were the only one who did. You got my record cleared, gave me a chance to enter the academy." Celeste didn't speak. She didn't need to. She knew Rick hadn't come for forgiveness. "I can't undo what happened to you," he continued, finally meeting her eyes. "But maybe I can help you protect others. Not with a gun, with proof." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, not to excuse, but to acknowledge that in a world stratified by skin and street name, sometimes standing up, after years of silence, is a way of making yourself whole again. You still have time, Celeste said, her voice even, not to erase it, but to never repeat it. Rick nodded. He didn't say another word, nor did he turn away like someone eager to close the conversation. He stood still. And in that stillness, the silence between them spoke more loudly than anything else. His throat felt dry, like he'd emerged from a desert of years spent swallowing his doubts. A part of him wanted to sigh, but the breath caught in his chest, stuck behind the decisions he had once clung to in order to avoid being seen as a traitor. His hands, long accustomed to gun straps and duty logs, now clenched inside his jacket sleeves, not from fear of exposure, but from the weight of finally facing himself. He remembered Celeste's eyes from years ago, when she sat across from him in a juvenile courtroom. Back then, he was just a scared kid caught between two worlds, one where his skin and circumstances pre-convicted him, and another offering the slim chance that someone might believe his side. Celeste hadn't seen him as a burden to manage. She saw him as someone worth saving, and today she looked at him the same way, only this time, she didn't need to save him. He had to decide what to do with the part of himself she once fought to protect. Celeste looked down at the hard drive one last time before slipping it into the inner pocket of her coat. She knew what was inside wouldn't just confirm the system Faulkner had built, it would expose the quiet alliance behind it, from prosecutors to patrol squads, from county to state. She also knew that once this evidence was released, she would no longer be just a prosecutor or a witness. She would be the one knocking on the door of a room where that powerful thought was untouchable. As Celeste walked out of the parking garage, her steps were no longer light. They were heavy, deliberate, like the beat of a drum echoing through the hollow of a rotten structure. Because this time, she didn't just have a voice, she had the map to the truth. And her weapon wasn't fury, it was law. It was evidence. It was the will of people who had been silent for too long, but who today had finally risen to their feet. That morning, Detroit was strangely quiet. The streets, usually humming with car horns and chatter from cafe patios, fell silent, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting for something long overdue to finally be called by its name. Inside the federal courthouse, the largest courtroom, typically reserved for high-profile cases, had been requisitioned for a very different kind of hearing, not for a person, but for a structure. The gallery was packed, press seats stretched along both walls, and those once mapped into Tier 12 were present, not to reclaim their dignity, but to witness the moment the truth could no longer be buried beneath administrative jargon. At the center of it all stood Celeste, no longer wearing a federal badge on her lapel, no longer backed by a desk or the protection of the system she once served. Today, she was simply a citizen, a plaintiff, a woman betrayed by the very institution she had helped uphold. But it was that betrayal that made her the most credible voice in the room, not through power, but through undeniable truth. Presiding over the hearing was Judge Evelyn Monroe, dispatched from Washington to ensure the proceedings' neutrality. She skipped the formalities. Instead, she opened with one sentence. "We are not here to try a person. We are here to try a system. And if people built that system, then today they too must stand before it." Celeste stepped up to the witness stand holding the file she had revised dozens of times in the past nights. She did not begin with accusations. She began with a question. If a 14-year-old boy is tagged as high risk simply for living in a predominantly black neighborhood and is monitored until he finally reacts out of fear, who is to blame? The one who snapped the cuffs, or the one who created the list that ensured he'd be cuffed from the day he was born? She didn't wait for an answer. Tier 12 is not a rogue algorithm. It's a deliberately built network. It begins at the prosecutor's office, where certain zones are flagged for high-resistance behavior, then moves to the police department, where those flags become patrol orders. From there, every small infraction, tardiness, an excused absence, a traffic ticket, is added as a data point, pushing innocent people closer and closer to handcuffs. On the screen behind her, maps appeared, visualizing district-by-district surveillance zones where skin color had effectively become a metric for scrutiny. I don't need to explain further. I only need to show you this. Celeste took out a small USB and plugged it into the courtroom display system. The screen lit up, playing the video captured from her button camera, the full, unedited conversation with Gerald Faulkner, which no one in that courtroom had heard in its entirety. Faulkner's voice rang out, calm and deliberate. "You'll never win against a city that believes everything's fine as long as no one is shouting. And you'll never win against a system where every silent person is another brick keeping it standing." No one moved. When the video ended, Celeste lowered her hand and looked directly at the defense table, where Faulkner sat, his suit pressed, his hands clenched beneath the table, his eyes dim not from light, but from the loss of control over the narrative. "I'm not asking for vengeance," Celeste said. "I'm asking for oversight. This system cannot self-correct. It must be examined by those outside of it. I'm requesting an independent federal investigation from the DOJ. I'm requesting the full public release of the Tier 12 list. And I'm requesting the immediate suspension of every individual involved in maintaining, protecting, or expanding this discriminatory structure, from the Detroit Prosecutor's Office, the police department, to internal IT contractors, including Chief Prosecutor Gerald Faulkner, who architected its foundation." She paused, but did not step back. "And one more name, Officer Trent Harlan, who stops me outside this courthouse without asking for ID, without an investigation, who relied only on the color of my skin. His actions were not an isolated mistake. They were the product of this system, which is why he must be the first to leave it." Judge Monroe sat in silence for a few moments before nodding. After an hour of deliberation, she read the ruling aloud. "Based on the presented evidence, testimonies, and digital records, the court finds that the Tier 12 system constitutes an unconstitutional surveillance network rooted in unauthorized demographic profiling. The plaintiff's requests are granted. The Detroit Prosecutor's Office will be placed under federal oversight for the duration of the investigation. Chief Prosecutor Gerald Faulkner is hereby suspended, pending charges should a federal inquiry confirm criminal collusion. Officer Trent Harlan is discharged from duty, effective immediately." A collective exhale swept across the room, not one of relief, but of a pressure finally released after years of silent tension. Faulkner said nothing as he was escorted out. Harlan bowed his head without protest. Other names, assistant prosecutors, precinct commanders, were listed in the expanding investigation. But to Celeste, the true conviction wasn't about lost jobs. It was about the fact that, for the first time, what they once labeled an internal matter had been dragged into the town square, where justice was no longer a privilege, but an obligation. And for the first time, Celeste walked out of court not as the one who won the case, but as someone who had survived a war with an enemy that had no face, no form, but had embedded itself into every layer of modern American life. And she knew. Today, part of it had been cut away, not by revolt, but by a trial for the system itself. 4 days after the historic ruling at the Detroit Federal Court, an old brick wall at the corner of Brush and Monroe suddenly drew a crowd. There was no ribbon cutting, no ceremonial speeches, only the smell of fresh paint, bold colors still wet, and a quiet swell of emotion rising from the sidewalk. On what used to be a peeling surface now stood an image that made anyone passing by stop in their tracks. It was Celeste Morgan, not in a prosecutor's robe or polished attire befitting a dignitary, but in the gray suit she wore the morning she was arrested. Her right arm was raised, not clenched in defiance, but steady, resolute, like a marker planted against unconscious submission. Her eyes looked straight ahead, not with bravado, but sharp enough to cut through any euphemism about internal matters. Behind her, strokes of red and gold blazed, not as destructive fire, but the light of a dawn both radiant and aching. At the top, sprayed in bold black paint, "Justice looks like this." The mural bore no artist's signature, but below it, hundreds of names were scribbled in all kinds of handwriting, some slanted, some shaky, some childishly uneven, each one a testimony that they had chosen to stand on the side of what's right, or at the very least had not turned away when justice called. Celeste hadn't been present during the painting. She hadn't known. But that morning, when a former colleague sent her a picture of the wall, she sat silently by her window, holding the image in her hand without reacting. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply stared at the image, not as if admiring it, but as if trying to determine whether that reflection truly belonged to her. She had never dreamed of becoming a symbol. She never believed that one image could shift the foundation of a society. But that afternoon, when she decided to walk past the wall, wearing a low-brimmed hat and carrying then nothing but a folded newspaper, she understood. A symbol isn't created to glorify the individual. It is formed when enough people need a face to look at, to know they are not alone. Beneath the mural, a group of middle schoolers stood in a circle. They weren't loud. They simply stood, staring upward, trying to understand how one woman could matter so much to them. A brown-skinned boy, about 10 years old, wearing a white t-shirt that read "Future Lawyer," stood beside Celeste, unaware that the woman herself was standing right there. He leaned toward his friend and whispered, loud enough for Celeste to hear, "I want to be a lawyer," because she got arrested and wasn't scared. The words carried no pity. They were a declaration that courage isn't about avoiding pain, but choosing to move forward even when the system pushes you to the margins. Celeste didn't speak. She only tilted her head slightly to look at him, then walked away, leaving no name, revealing no identity. Because she knew that when a child could look at a face once shamed and call it the face of justice, what mattered most wasn't the person in the painting. It was the dreams growing beneath it. That night, back in her small apartment on the city's north side, a stack of letters awaited her, filtered and forwarded by the office staff. Among them, one was from an 82-year-old woman who had been denied service in a pharmacy back in 1963. Another was from a white law student who wrote, "For the first time I see law not just as rules, but as hope." And one short letter, barely 3 lines, scribbled in ink by hand. "You didn't make me feel small. You made me want to try harder." Celeste folded each letter and placed them into a small wooden box. She didn't frame her awards, didn't mount headlines, but that box she placed on the bookshelf, right above the Federal Criminal Code, as a reminder that above every clause, every section, every rule, there is always a human being. And she understood, from this day forward, the image of her on that wall was no longer a symbol. It was the truth that a brown-skinned woman could be wrongfully arrested, publicly humiliated at the very institution she once served, and still rise, still hold on to her integrity, and force an entire system to bow. And that truth, once recognized, could never be painted over, nor erased from the memory of a generation growing up with justice, not as a distant concept in textbooks, but as the real face of someone who dared to confront an entire city, with intellect, with faith, and with a heart unwilling to fall silent. Late in the afternoon, the golden light of sunset filtered through the window of the small apartment where Celeste lived with her daughter, casting a soft amber glow across the wall. In the kitchen, the scent of cookies from the midday baking still lingered. Celeste was finishing up a stack of legal files to send to the civil rights legal team, while the scratch of crayon on paper echoed gently across the room. Amara was drawing at the dining table, tongue peeking out slightly in that familiar way she always had when concentrating. In her drawing was a little girl in a brown blazer holding a briefcase. Across the sky behind her, written in uneven purple crayon, were the words, "I can be brave too." Celeste glanced over, and her heart clenched, not at the drawing itself, but at the realization that her daughter was starting to see the world through the links in a chain that stretched back through her mother's past. Amara looked up, her wide eyes not carrying the carefree innocence typical of 8-year-olds, but something more clear-eyed, more aware. "Mom, if I wear a blazer like yours one day, go to work like you do, will they stop my car too?" The question dropped into the room like a quiet drop of water, but stirred the entire still lake beneath. Celeste stood still. She had heard thousands of questions in her life, from witnesses, victims, colleagues, but none had ever weighed on her chest the way this one did. She walked over and sat beside her daughter, not rushing to answer. She gently stroked Amara's soft curls, looking deep into those eyes, waiting for the truth, and in them, she didn't see fear. She saw awareness, a kind of awareness a child shouldn't have to carry. "I can't promise they won't," she whispered, voice low, as if afraid to shatter something fragile. "But I can promise you this. If they do, you'll know who you are. You'll know how to step out of that car without bowing your head or trembling. And you'll know that somewhere out there, hundreds of thousands of people once stood up for you, even if they never knew your name." Amara didn't respond. She simply leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, still holding the drawing in her hand, smudging the corner where the purple letters were slightly blurred by sweat. Celeste pulled her daughter in closer, not just to protect her, but to pass along something it had taken her years to build: conviction. In that moment, she understood. Every courtroom, every hearing, every time she stood to speak, it had all been worth it. Not for victory, not for recognition, but for a question like this, when asked, would never again be met with fear or evasion. It would be answered with truth, with strength, and with hope that the next generation wouldn't have to learn how to survive, but how to live right. That night, after Amara had drifted to sleep, Celeste stepped out onto the balcony. The city still glowed, not from government buildings, but from the banners reading "Justice looks like this" hanging from porches, buses, and shop fronts. She saw a group of teenagers sitting beneath the mural, reading essays for their civics class, holding printouts with her image and the words, "We're not afraid of the system, we'll build a better one." Celeste smiled, not out of pride, but because she knew that image of her no longer belonged to her. It was an image of the future, a future where a little girl in a brown blazer wouldn't be judged by her skin tone, where mothers wouldn't have to fear their child being stopped just for walking or driving or simply not being white enough. And then she returned to Amara's room, kissed her gently on the forehead, and whispered like a prayer, "I walked ahead so you could go farther. But if you ever have to step into this fight, I'll always be right behind you." In that small room, under the warmth of the bedside lamp, courage wasn't something for grown-ups or headlines. It was a promise, quiet, steady, passed through blood, through memory, through a love no system could ever silence. And that was why, when Amara asked whether wearing a brown blazer would get her stopped, Celeste didn't look away. Because a just America won't be built by dodging hard questions, but by facing them, together. 1 month after the historic trial in Detroit, the Michigan State Capitol became the center of national attention as media outlets across the country reported the same headline: Morgan Act officially passed. It ran on morning news shows, appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and even in bulletins that rarely paid attention to state legislation. But it wasn't because the bill's language was particularly radical. It was because for the first time in modern history, An anti-racial profiling law was named after someone who had been unjustly arrested right outside a courthouse. Her name, Celeste Morgan, was now embedded in the title of a legal document. But what weighed on her wasn't the honor. It was the content of the law itself. The Morgan Act outlined 3 key provisions. First, the establishment of an independent civilian oversight board with authority to access patrol logs, internal investigations, and issue mandatory recommendations to law enforcement agencies. Second, a requirement to release quarterly patrol data broken down by race, age, and neighborhood for public review. And third, a ban on the use of predictive policing algorithms unless vetted by independent audits led by civil organizations. For many, it was an unprecedented step forward, but for Celeste, it was only the starting line, because justice, once inked into law, still demands thousands of actions to carry it from policy into lived reality. That day, the legislative chamber was packed. Those who had marched after her arrest, families of people marked as potential threats, children who had once watched their parents searched without cause, they were all there, not to cheer, but to witness whether justice could be shaped within the very system that once denied it. Celeste stood at the podium, no longer in her signature gray suit. Instead, she wore a simple blouse and long skirt. No logo, no title, no uniform of office. She didn't stand there as a prosecutor or a plaintiff, but as a mother. Her voice was low and slow, not meant to impress but to be heard. This law bears my name, but it wasn't written by me alone. It's written from the silenced screams lodged in the throats of thousands, from the wary eyes of toddlers who already know how to sit still when they see flashing lights, from stories that never made the evening news. She paused, then looked around the chamber, not to seek attention, but because she could feel the weight of expectation pressing in from every direction. I don't need to be called a symbol. I don't need spotlights on a stage. I just need to know that my daughter, and yours, won't have to justify their existence just because of the color of their skin. In that moment, the room fell into complete silence. No applause, no one stood. Just a collective stillness, as if everyone present could feel that what she had just said wasn't a speech to be archived. It was a truth they had all lived through and were now trying to change. As Celeste stepped down, she caught the gaze of Asha Wilkins, the young girl who had once vanished after being stopped on her way to take an exam. Asha didn't say a word. She just nodded. And in that single nod, Celeste understood. Everything she had done was worth it, even if it only meant that one girl could walk into adulthood without having to live in silence. That day marked the start of something new for Asha. At first, she returned to school just a few hours a week, then more. By the new academic year, she applied to retake the SAT and scored in the top 5% statewide. Her teachers called it a miracle. But Celeste knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was survival, fueled by the belief that her voice had finally found someone who would listen. Today, Asha wore a crisp white shirt, top button fastened, hair neatly tied, and thin glasses perched on her nose. She stood quietly in the hallway, holding a folder close to her chest. She no longer avoided eye contact, no longer hid beneath oversized hoodies. She now carried herself the way she wanted the world to see her. A smart, confident, promising young black woman who didn't have to apologize for existing. Celeste walked toward her, not too fast, not too slow. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. One look, one smile, one soft nod, enough to say all that the system had once tried to silence between them. Asha was the future Celeste had fought to protect. And now, that girl was writing the next chapter for her community, not with anger, but with test scores, with thoughtful essays, with the determination to represent justice in her own way. Next year, Asha plans to apply to 3 top universities, including one that Celeste once attended. But what makes Celeste most proud isn't her recommendations or academic records. It's what Asha wrote in her statement. I want to study law not to seek revenge, but to rebuild the bridges past generations were forced to burn. I used to think my dreams were too much, but now I know if someone fought to keep them alive for me, then I have to fight to make sure they never die again. Celeste once asked herself whether any of what she had done would change anything, but seeing Asha today, steady, self-assured, radiant, she no longer needs an answer. Because sometimes, one person making it through the darkness isn't just their victory. It's the light that shows a whole generation how to step off the curb of prejudice. And Asha, now, is that light. That afternoon, the sky over Detroit carried an unusually gentle shade of blue. The trees outside the federal courthouse swayed softly in the wind, as if bowing in rhythm with the footsteps of those leaving. The final session had officially concluded, not with a sharp bang of the gavel, but with a silence worthy of reverence, a kind of quiet this place had never known before, not out of fear, but out of respect. Celeste stepped out from the main hall of the federal courthouse with a walk lighter than it had been in years, as if she'd finally laid down a weight she'd carried for far too long. The iconic gray suit that had come to define her from the early days of fighting injustice was replaced by a plain, understated one, because now she needed no symbols, only the presence of those waiting for her. Then, through the dispersing crowd at the marble steps, a familiar voice rang out. "Mom!" Amara, in a deep red dress and worn sneakers, ran forward, throwing her arms around Celeste as if afraid her mother might vanish into another battle if she let go. She didn't ask anything, didn't say a word, just held her, as if that embrace alone could express what most adults never dared to offer to those who had protected them. Celeste bent down and hugged her back. In that moment, every ounce of exhaustion, from hearings, arguments, and nights spent alone with doubts about the system, melted away like smoke. Not because the fight was over, but now she knew she wasn't fighting alone. In the distance, the group of students who had painted the Justice looks like this mural stood under the trees, arms raised, faces beaming. One girl held up a cardboard sign that read, "Thanks for proving we matter." Celeste smiled at them, then turned toward the crowd filtering into the parking lot. A middle-aged woman quietly approached, her walk slightly uneven, eyes glassy with tears, yet filled with pride. She didn't introduce herself, didn't recount her own story. She simply looked at Celeste, tilted her head, and said in a low, almost whispered voice, "You didn't just stand up. You made the whole city look at itself." Celeste gently held her hand without saying thank you, because sometimes gratitude isn't enough to describe the bond between those the system forgot, yet who still held on to what was right. Behind the courthouse, a few former prosecutors, who had once stayed silent during Celeste's isolation, stood huddled together. They didn't step forward, but when their eyes met hers, they nodded. A nod not of excuse or apology, but of acknowledgement and quiet gratitude. The shadows began to stretch across the courthouse steps, where just months earlier she had been handcuffed under the indifferent gaze of a city not yet ready to confront its fractures. But today, that very place had become a space where people lined up to sign their support for the Morgan Act, a place where students read essays on civil rights, a place where Celeste did not fall, and because of that, many others could rise. She looked down at her daughter, gripping her hand tightly, a wide smile on her ink-stained face. Amara didn't understand every clause her mother had fought for, but she understood this. From today onward, if anyone asked, "What does justice look like?" she could simply point to her mother and not need to say a word. Celeste leaned down and whispered into her daughter's ear, "You know, I haven't won yet." Amara looked up, surprised, but this time Celeste smiled her eyes glowing with unshakable conviction. "I'm not fighting alone." At that moment, the Detroit sky turned golden like a curtain gently falling on a closed act. But inside Celeste, another door was opening, not for one person, but for an America beginning to relearn how to look into the mirror and ask, who are we when we no longer deny? A hug, a smile, a quiet sentence that didn't shout but struck deep. And in that simplicity, victory had already arrived, not just for a brown-skinned woman in a gray suit, but for so many who had been forgotten, erased, and now, at last, were seen, heard, and allowed to live as they deserve. The story of Celeste Morgan didn't begin with a courtroom. It began with a pair of hands in cuffs, right at the gates of justice. But from that humiliation, she became a flame that lit up the cracks of a broken system. She didn't need to shout. She didn't fight with fists. Celeste moved forward, step by step, armed with knowledge, unwavering resolve, and a love for justice that refused to compromise. She didn't win alone. She reignited faith for thousands who had been forced into silence. If one day you see an innocent person arrested in front of a place called the symbol of the law, will you look away or will you stay and stand? If this story made you think, hit like, share, and subscribe to help spread more stories like this. Stories of awakening, where justice is no longer just in the pages of a book, but in the hearts of those brave enough to break the silence.